Bryce had always been drawn to the solitude of his art. A graffiti artist by passion and a rule breaker by necessity, he preferred the forgotten corners of Louisville, Kentucky to practice his craft. For him, the quiet expanse of old freight trains, nestled in overgrown lots, was the perfect canvas. No rival artists to deface his work. No prying eyes to report his presence. It was here, among the rust and weeds, that he felt most alive. On this particular night, Bryce wasn't alone. His best friend, Evan, tagged along. While Evan wasn't much of an artist, he never turned down a late-night adventure. The air was cool, thick with the faint metallic tang of the train yard. A crescent moon hung low, casting fragmented light through the gaps in the trees. The train they approached stretched endlessly into the night, its cars cloaked in rust and silence. Bryce grinned as he pulled out his cans. "Untouched," he muttered. "Guess I'm the first." Evan leaned against one of the cars, lighting a joint and exhaling a cloud of smoke. Bryce popped the cap on his paint can, the familiar hiss of spray paint breaking the stillness. He moved quickly but deliberately, the colors flowing effortlessly as he worked. Evan watched from the sidelines, occasionally offering a laugh or a sarcastic remark. Bryce didn't mind. The companionship was comforting in the eerie quiet of the abandoned tracks. By the time Bryce stepped back to admire his work, he'd already emptied 2 cans. The vibrant tags sprawled across 3 adjacent cars, each one flowing into the next in a chaotic, mesmerizing display. He tossed the empty cans behind him, relishing the satisfying clatter as they struck the gravel. "Not bad, huh?" Bryce said, turning toward Evan, who was already lighting his second joint. He hesitated when Evan offered him a drag. Bryce wasn't a regular smoker. Weed had a habit of making him paranoid. But tonight, with his art complete and the thrill of the forbidden buzzing in his chest, he figured one hit wouldn't hurt. They were laughing softly when the first sound broke through the night, a metallic clang, sharp and deliberate. Both froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. It wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. "What was that?" Bryce whispered, his voice barely audible. Evan shrugged, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. "Probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Another sound followed, this time louder, a clattering echo of metal on metal. Bryce squinted into the darkness beyond the train, his breath catching in his throat. The tracks stretched into shadow, endless and empty, or so he thought. A third sound shattered the stillness, the unmistakable rattle of one of Bryce's discarded spray cans being thrown. Then, from the darkness, a voice, a guttural snarl that sent ice coursing through Bryce's veins. Run. They didn't need to be told twice. For weeks, Bryce couldn't stop replaying that night. The metallic clang, the chilling voice, the crack of the gunshot. It all haunted him like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just some deranged local trying to scare off trespassers. But the questions lingered. Who was it? Why were they so angry? And what were they doing there in the dead of night? The mystery gnawed at him until he couldn't resist anymore. On a brisk October afternoon, Bryce decided to go back to the tracks. This time, he came prepared. A Glock 17 sat snugly in his bag, a weighty reassurance against the unease curling in his gut. He also made sure to arrive in broad daylight, hoping the sunlight would expose whatever had been lurking in the shadows. As he parked his car and stepped into the overgrown lot, Bryce immediately noticed something different. The freight train was still there, sitting in the same position as before, but his tags were gone. In their place were jagged blotches of red paint, smeared hastily across the cars. The bright, angry streaks seemed almost accusatory, as if someone had deliberately defaced his work out of spite. Bryce felt his stomach knot. Whoever had been out there that night had returned, and they wanted to send a message. Ignoring the unease crawling up his spine, Bryce walked the length of the train, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. As he neared the middle of the train line, something caught his attention. One of the car doors was slightly ajar. The dark opening yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Against his better judgment, Bryce stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Peering inside, Bryce was struck by the eerie stillness of the scene. The car's interior was empty, save for a single wooden chair positioned dead center. Thick ropes were coiled haphazardly around the chair's arms and legs, as if someone had hastily abandoned a project midway through. Scattered around the chair were chains, their metal links glinting faintly in the weak sunlight, filtering through the cracks in the walls. But what hit Bryce the hardest was the smell, a harsh, chemical stench of bleach so strong it made his eyes water. The entire car reeked of it, as though someone had doused the place in a desperate attempt to erase something. Bryce fumbled for his phone and snapped a picture, his hands trembling slightly. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was this some kind of hideout? A scene of something darker? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into the aftermath of something he wasn't meant to see. Then the silence was broken. Somewhere farther down the train, a faint metallic clang echoed through the still air. The sound was subtle, but it froze Bryce in place, his heart pounding against his ribs. Was it the wind? An animal? Or was someone or something watching him? He didn't wait to find out. Clutching his bag, Bryce turned and walked briskly back toward the car, resisting the urge to run. The smell of bleach lingered in his nostrils long after he left, a ghostly reminder of what he had found and what he might never understand. The images Bryce had captured stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind like a bad omen. The chair, the ropes, the overwhelming smell of bleach, it all pointed to something sinister, something he couldn't explain but couldn't forget. As the days passed, he found himself replaying the events in his mind, imagining the shadowed figure who had chased him that night. What kind of person would cover his graffiti with such angry, careless strokes? And what was the purpose of that chair in the train car? The more he thought about it, the more questions gnawed at him. Bryce shared his story with a few trusted friends, but their theories did little to settle his unease. Probably just some drifter who didn't want you trespassing, one friend suggested. You know, territorial types. Another guessed it might have been a squatter who'd set up some kind of bizarre makeshift home. But none of those ideas accounted for the gunshot or the bleach, two details that stood out like bloody fingerprints against the backdrop of an already unsettling mystery. Late one night, Bryce sat on his couch scrolling through the photos he had taken that day. His finger hovered over the picture of the chair, zooming in on the ropes and chains scattered around it. He couldn't help but notice the wear on the chair's legs, as though it had been dragged across the floor many times. The bleach smell, he thought, wasn't just to clean, it was to erase. The realization sent a chill down his spine. What had happened in that car? Bryce considered going back to the tracks once more, this time with a friend for backup. Maybe if he revisited the scene, he'd find some clue he had missed, something that could make sense of it all. But the memory of the gunshot echoed too loudly in his mind. The voice that had snarled, "You better not trip, boy," was still fresh in his ears. It wasn't worth the risk, he told himself. Whoever had been out there that night clearly wasn't afraid to hurt someone to protect their secrets. As much as he tried to let it go, Bryce couldn't escape the paranoia that followed. Every time he walked to his car or took out the trash late at night, he found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the distance. When he lay in bed, the smell of bleach seemed to cling to his memory, so sharp it felt as though it were in the room with him. One night, just as Bryce was beginning to drift off, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an unknown number, the message short and chilling. "Stay off the tracks." His blood ran cold as he stared at the screen. Who could have sent it? How did they even have his number? His first instinct was to call the police, but he stopped himself. What could he say? That he'd been trespassing and now felt threatened? The authorities wouldn't take him seriously, not when he'd been breaking the law in the first place. Bryce deleted the message and locked his phone, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The tracks had become more than a canvas for his art. They were a gateway to something darker, something he couldn't explain, but knew he had narrowly escaped. Now, when he tells the story, Bryce always ends with the same thought. If I'd stayed just a moment longer, that chair might have been waiting for me. Aiden hadn't been back to his hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, in years. The summer had forced him home, though, just a week to endure before his flight to Germany. To pass the time, he explored old hiking trails, drove aimlessly along winding mountain roads, and drowned himself in the nostalgia of childhood haunts. But on his last day, he grew restless. He wanted something more, something that didn't feel so ordinary. That's when he remembered the tracks. Years ago, train hopping had been an adrenaline-fueled escape from the monotony of small-town life. Back then, Aiden and his friends would climb aboard slow-moving freight trains and ride them through the woods, across bridges, and even into tunnels. The thought of those wild nights sent a rush of nostalgia through him, and he couldn't resist the idea of one last ride before leaving town for good. The tracks he chose were tucked away in the outskirts, shielded by thick trees and shrouded in a peculiar quiet. They ran straight through a long, dark tunnel before emerging on the other side near a massive steel bridge spanning the French Broad River. The plan was simple: hop onto the train, ride through the tunnel, and jump off at the clearing beyond. From there, he'd walk back to his car. Easy. Aiden parked his car near the tree line and followed the rusted tracks into the woods. The air was heavy, humid, and thick with the faint buzz of cicadas. As he walked, he glanced around, soaking in the quiet isolation of the place. It was mid-afternoon, but the shadows cast by the dense trees made it feel later. After a few minutes, he heard the faint rumble of a train approaching, the vibration traveling through the metal rails under his feet. He crouched low, waiting for the train to pass. As it approached, the sound of its grinding wheels grew louder, reverberating through the trees like thunder. Aiden felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as he jogged alongside one of the slower cars, gripping the ladder and hauling himself up with practiced ease. The train rattled beneath him as it rumbled toward the tunnel, the dark mouth looming larger with every second. The moment the train entered the tunnel, Aiden was plunged into darkness. The cool, damp air wrapped around him like a shroud, and the sounds of the train echoed harshly against the stone walls. He gripped the ladder tightly, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with the thrill of the moment. Then, something brushed against his leg. At first, Aiden thought it might have been a low-hanging branch or a stray piece of debris stirred up by the train. But when it happened again, firmer this time, a chill ran down his spine. He peered into the shadows below, but the darkness was impenetrable. That's when he felt it, a rough, unyielding grip around his ankle. Aiden screamed, his voice swallowed by the cacophony of the train as he kicked wildly to free himself. The hand let go, only for another to grab him, harder, almost dragging him off the ladder. He scrambled higher, gripping the metal rungs until his knuckles turned white. When the train burst from the tunnel into the daylight, Aiden didn't hesitate. He let go of the ladder, hitting the gravel below with a thud and rolling to a stop. The train continued on, disappearing over the bridge. He lay there, shaking, staring back at the tunnel's dark maw, his mind racing. Something or someone had been in there with him. Aiden sat on the gravel just beyond the tunnel, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. The sunlight was warm, reassuring against his clammy skin, but it did little to ease the knot of fear twisting in his stomach. He turned to look back at the tunnel's dark opening, its jagged edges framing an impenetrable void. The thought of what had grabbed him inside made his skin crawl. He needed to get out of here. But then the realization hit him. His car was on the other side. The train had carried him through the tunnel, leaving him stranded with no easy escape. The only options were to brave the bridge ahead, where a single misstep could send him plummeting into the rushing French Broad River, or to go back through the tunnel. Neither felt safe, but the thought of crossing the narrow bridge with no room to maneuver if another train came chilled him. With no better choice, Aiden picked up a fist-sized rock from the ground and gripped it tightly. The tunnel loomed before him, an uninviting maw of shadows that seemed to swallow the sunlight. He took a deep breath, trying to muster courage, and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the cool air wrapping around him like icy fingers. His footsteps echoed loudly, each one bouncing off the stone walls and reverberating back to him like mocking whispers. Aiden tried to focus on the faint pinprick of light at the far end. "Just keep moving," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. But as he walked deeper, the light seemed impossibly far away, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Then a sound stopped him cold. Click. It was faint but deliberate, like someone clucking their tongue. Aiden froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He strained to listen, but the silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, he resumed walking, his grip tightening on the rock. His steps were quieter now, each one carefully placed to avoid making too much noise. Click. This time, the sound was closer. His breath hitched and his hands began to shake. "Stay back!" he yelled into the void, his voice echoing endlessly. The clicking stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence that felt heavier than before. Aiden's mind raced. Was it a person? An animal? Something worse? He pulled out his phone, fumbling with the screen as he searched for a gunshot sound effect. The tunnel felt alive, watching, waiting. Finally, he found the video and hit play. The gunshot blasted through the tunnel, louder than he expected, the echoes crashing around him like thunder. "I'm armed," he shouted, his voice trembling with the lie. For a moment, the tunnel was silent again. Aiden dared to hope he had scared off whatever or whoever was there. But then it came, a shrill, guttural scream that erupted from the darkness. It was unlike anything Aiden had ever heard, raw, primal, and inhuman. The scream shook him to his core, paralyzing him where he stood. The echoes twisted and stretched, filling the tunnel with a sound that felt alive. Aiden didn't wait to hear more. He bolted toward the distant light, his footsteps pounding against the rails as the scream followed him, growing louder, closer. The air grew colder the farther he ran, his breath ragged and his legs burning. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going, not to look back, not to stop. He could feel it now, a presence, something behind him, closing the distance with every second. The light at the tunnel's end grew larger, but it still felt impossibly far. Finally, he burst out into the clearing, collapsing onto the gravel as sunlight bathed him once more. But the scream didn't follow him out. The tunnel stood silent, its shadows deep and foreboding, as if it were daring him to come back. Aiden's relief was short-lived as a faint clicking sound echoed from the darkness, sending a shiver down his spine. Whatever was in there wasn't done with him. Aiden collapsed onto the gravel just outside the tunnel, the sunlight hitting his face like a lifeline. His chest heaved with each gasping breath, the cool air burning his lungs. For a brief, fleeting moment, he felt safe. He had made it out. The tunnel, the suffocating darkness, the horrifying sounds was behind him. But that relief quickly dissolved into dread. He turned to look back, half expecting the tunnel to appear empty, his fears unfounded. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Two silhouettes stood motionless just beyond the threshold of darkness, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows around them. They were tall, unnervingly still, and eerily human-shaped, yet something about them felt wrong. Their presence radiated menace, as though the tunnel itself was holding its breath in their presence. Aiden froze, his legs trembling under him as he stared at the figures. One of them tilted its head, a slow and deliberate movement that sent shivers rippling through his body. The gesture wasn't curious, it was calculated, almost mocking. The low growl came next, deep and guttural, like the rumble of something massive and unseen stirring within the earth. Aiden's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. His mind raced. What are they? Why are they just standing there? Then, without warning, the figures moved, not toward him, but deeper into the tunnel. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were puppets being dragged along by unseen strings. Aiden thought he might have imagined it, but the screeching started again, that same inhuman, rage-filled sound, echoing through the tunnel and spilling into the open air like a living entity. The sound was enough to break him. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling over the gravel as he bolted toward the safety of the woods. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. The thought of those figures, whatever they were, closing the distance behind him pushed him forward. As he neared the tree line, the tunnel's final howl erupted, louder and more guttural than before. It sounded like a warning, or worse, a promise. Aiden didn't dare look back. The woods felt suffocating now, the tangled branches and dense underbrush grabbing at him like claws. His only focus was the distant shimmer of his car in the afternoon light. When he reached the vehicle, his hands shook so violently that he struggled to unlock the door. Finally, he wrenched it open, threw himself inside, and slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively. He didn't take a moment to breathe before starting the engine and peeling out of the dirt lot, his tires kicking up gravel as he sped away. Even as the tunnel faded into the distance, the terror didn't leave him. Days passed, but the memory of those figures haunted him relentlessly. At night, he could still hear the sounds, the clicking, the screeching, the growl. And when he closed his eyes, he saw their shapes looming in the dark, unmoving but ever present. Each time they appeared in his dreams, they felt closer. And each time, Aiden woke up with the same chilling thought: they're still waiting for me. Greg Thompson had grown used to the strange, quiet moments that came with working late shifts for the Metro in Washington, D.C. As a maintenance worker, he often found himself alone in the cavernous stations during the dead of night. He had come to enjoy the solitude, the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights, and the distant rumble of trains far down the line. But something about this night at Judiciary Square Station felt different. The silence wasn't calming. It was oppressive, heavy, and watchful. It was nearly midnight, and Greg was wrapping up his shift. He pushed his mop across the slick tile platform, the sound of water sloshing and the scrape of the mop head echoing into the vast emptiness. He liked to think of himself as unshakable. Over his years on the job, he dealt with his fair share of unusual situations. Run-ins with drunk passengers, rats as bold as stray cats, and even the occasional prankster trying to sneak into the tunnels. But this night carried a tension he couldn't quite place. He glanced up from his work and let his eyes wander toward the tunnel entrance at the far end of the platform. The arched opening loomed in the distance, a black void that seemed to stretch infinitely. The station's overhead lights flickered briefly, a faint buzz accompanying the dimming and brightening. Greg's stomach twisted, but he dismissed the feeling as nerves from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Shaking his head, he returned to his work. The first sound broke through the silence like a hammer striking steel. A sharp metallic clang echoed from the tunnel, freezing Greg mid-motion. He stood still, his hands gripping the mop handle as he stared at the dark entrance. The noise didn't sound like the usual groan of old infrastructure. It was deliberate, purposeful, and far too loud to ignore. His pulse quickened as he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a loose bolt shifting under the pressure of a train, or a piece of equipment falling. But when he listened again, the stillness that followed felt unnerving. The tunnel seemed to hold its breath, daring him to investigate. Swallowing hard, Greg grabbed his flashlight from the work cart. Its weight felt comforting in his hand as he stepped cautiously toward the edge of the platform. He shone the beam into the dark tunnel, illuminating only the first few feet of the tracks before the light was swallowed by shadow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. The tunnel gave no response, only the distant hum of the station lights behind him. Just as he turned to go back to his cart, the noise came again. Closer this time, sharper and more deliberate. Greg felt a chill crawl up his spine. Before he could decide whether to call it in, a new sound joined the echoes. A child's voice, faint and trembling. "Help me," it said. The words stopped Greg cold. His grip tightened on the flashlight, and he scanned the tunnel again. The voice was faint but unmistakable. A child, alone in the tunnel? That was impossible. The tunnels were no place for a kid, or anyone for that matter. "Where are you?" Greg shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The response came immediately, calm and steady. "I'm here. Just keep walking." Greg hesitated. The voice didn't sound panicked, but something about the tone sent a chill through him. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility of a child in danger. Against his better judgment, he climbed down onto the tracks. The air in the tunnel was cool and damp, and as he stepped into the shadows, the darkness seemed to press in around him. "Keep walking," the voice said again, a little louder now, a little closer. Greg moved forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The silence that followed was deafening, and with every step, his unease grew. Something wasn't right, but it was too late to turn back now. Greg's boots scraped against the cold metal rails as he ventured deeper into the tunnel, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the thick blackness. The damp air clung to his skin, heavy with the faint smell of mildew and something metallic, almost like blood. The distant glow of the platform behind him grew smaller with each step, swallowed by the oppressive void ahead. He gripped the flashlight tighter, its trembling beam a fragile tether to reality. "Where are you?" he called again, his voice echoing endlessly. This time, the response was quicker. "Just keep walking," the boy's voice said, clear but unnervingly calm. It wasn't the desperate cry of a lost child. It was deliberate, almost patient. Greg's stomach churned, but the thought of a child in danger pushed him forward. He told himself that kids didn't always react rationally under stress. Maybe the boy was too scared to move or didn't understand the danger. Still, something about the way the voice floated through the tunnel didn't sit right. It didn't belong here. The flashlight flickered, and Greg cursed under his breath, giving it a sharp shake. The beam stabilized, but his heart was pounding now, each beat loud in his ears. The tunnel stretched on, the shadows pressing closer. His every step felt heavier, as though the air itself were resisting him. Then, the beam of his flashlight caught something on the ground, a shoe. It was small, meant for a child, and worn at the edges. The sight made Greg's chest tighten. He bent down to pick it up, holding it gingerly as though it might crumble in his hands. Mud was caked around the edges, and a cartoon character decal on the side was faded almost beyond recognition. "Hey, kid!" Greg called, his voice more urgent now. "I found your shoe. Are you okay?" Silence answered him, and for a moment, he thought he'd been imagining the voice altogether. But just as he started to stand, the boy spoke again, his tone steady and chilling. "I'm here. Keep walking." Greg swung the flashlight forward, the beam bouncing wildly as he scanned the tracks. His breath caught in his throat when the light settled on a figure standing in the middle of the rails. It was the boy. He was barefoot, his back turned to Greg, his small frame silhouetted against the deeper darkness of the tunnel. Relief washed over Greg for an instant, but it quickly gave way to unease. The boy wasn't moving. His arms hung limply at his sides, and he didn't seem frightened or hurt. Something about his stillness made Greg hesitate. "Hey, buddy," Greg said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Let's get out of here, okay? It's not safe down here." The boy didn't respond. Then, Greg's flashlight caught movement, just behind the boy. His breath hitched as another figure emerged from the shadows. This one was tall, impossibly thin, its body grotesquely elongated. It loomed over the boy, its presence radiating menace. Greg staggered back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The boy's voice came again, calm and almost playful this time. "Why are you leaving?" Panic surged through Greg as he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. The tall figure tilted its head, a jerky, unnatural movement that sent a shiver down his spine. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the tunnel itself were alive and bearing down on him. Without another word, Greg turned and ran, the sound of his boots pounding against the tracks. Behind him, the boy's voice echoed, louder now, chasing him like a predator. "Wait, don't go! Come back!" Greg didn't look back. He couldn't. Greg's breath burned in his lungs as he sprinted toward the faint glow of the station's lights. His boots pounded against the metal rails, the sound reverberating through the tunnel like a warning bell. Behind him, the boy's voice echoed louder, clearer, and far too close. "Wait! Come back! Don't leave me!" The words twisted in Greg's mind, their tone shifting with each repetition. They no longer sounded like a child's desperate plea, but something darker, something taunting. He risked a glance over his shoulder, and his heart seized. The boy and the towering figure stood together, motionless, watching. The boy's small silhouette was eerily still, his head tilted slightly. The taller figure loomed behind him, grotesque and unnatural. Its limbs bent at odd angles, and its elongated frame seemed to stretch toward the tunnel walls. Even in the faint light of his flashlight, Greg couldn't make out a face, just a void where one should have been. Then it moved. The figure crouched low, its limbs folding with impossible fluidity. Greg's legs nearly gave out as he turned back toward the station and pushed himself to run faster. The air felt colder now, thick and damp, as though the tunnel itself were trying to swallow him. The boy's voice rang out again, no longer pleading, but sharp, almost gleeful. "Why are you running, Greg?" Hearing his name made his blood turn to ice. He hadn't told anyone he was here. How could it know? The realization sent his thoughts spiraling, and he stumbled, nearly falling onto the tracks. As he steadied himself, a new sound joined the echoing voice, a scraping, metallic noise like claws dragging along the rails. Greg's flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as the tunnel walls seemed to close in around him. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out all other sound except the relentless pounding of his boots against the tracks. The faint glow of the platform ahead grew brighter, but it still felt impossibly far. Then came the screech, a high-pitched, guttural scream that filled the tunnel, reverberating off the walls and drilling into Greg's skull. It was inhuman, a mix of rage and pain, and it froze him mid-step. His instincts screamed for him to move, but his legs refused to obey. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by quick, erratic footsteps that echoed unnervingly close. Forcing his body to respond, Greg broke into a desperate sprint. The platform was so close now, just a few more steps. He threw himself onto the platform with a grunt, collapsing against the cold tiles as his flashlight clattered to the ground. His chest heaved as he stared back into the tunnel's darkness, his eyes wide with terror. For a moment, all was still. Then, from the black void, the boy emerged. He stood at the tunnel's edge, his bare feet just inches from the platform. His head tilted as he stared at Greg, unmoving. Behind him, the tall figure crouched low, its limbs twitching unnaturally. "Why did you leave?" the boy asked, his voice soft and almost sorrowful. Greg scrambled backward, his shaking hands fumbling for his radio. He managed to stammer a few broken words to dispatch, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable, even to himself. When the station lights flickered back to full strength, the boy and the figure were gone. Greg sat frozen, his back pressed against the wall, clutching the radio like a lifeline. The authorities arrived minutes later, but their search turned up nothing. No boy, no figure, no trace of anyone else in the tunnel. The only thing they found was a child's shoe lying neatly on the tracks, its mud-caked surface the only evidence of the horrors Greg had witnessed. Greg never returned to Judiciary Square Station, but even years later, in the quiet hours of the night, he sometimes heard the faint echo of a child's voice in his dreams. "Why did you leave me?"